My son stole 27 family photographs while I was lying in a hospital bed with heart monitors taped to my chest. 3 days later, he lost a $38,600 real estate commission, nearly destroyed his marriage, and accidentally triggered the clause that removed him from my family trust forever. Funny thing is, none of that happened because he took the pictures. It happened because he was too impatient to check the backs. You know that look people get when they think old folks are confused? I saw that look on Brandon's face 2 days before everything collapsed. Stay with me here because this story starts with empty walls and ends with the one photograph my late wife never wanted him to touch. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy real family stories with quiet revenge, hard truths, and a little humor in the middle of heartbreak, go ahead and subscribe. Now let me tell you what my son found behind my walls and what he missed. I've lived in the same house on South Perry Street in Spokane for 38 years. Small white craftsman-style place with green shutters that need repainting every other winter because Washington weather treats wood the way raccoons treat unsecured trash cans. The front porch sags a little on the left side. Always has. Linda used to joke that the house leaned toward the neighbors because it liked gossip. I still laugh at that sometimes, mostly when nobody's around. After my wife died 4 years ago, the house got quieter in the kind of way people don't warn you about. Not dramatic quiet, not movie quiet, just missing, noise quiet. No humming in the kitchen at 6:15 in the morning, no reading glasses left beside the sugar jar, no voice yelling from the hallway because I shrank another sweater in the dryer. You don't notice how much a person fills a home until they stop moving through it. So I kept the photographs up everywhere. Living room, hallway, stairwell. Even the laundry room had 3 framed pictures hanging above the old Whirlpool dryer that squealed like a dying squirrel every Tuesday. 27 photographs total. I know the exact number because I hung every single one myself using a Stanley tape measure and a yellow level Linda bought me at Home Depot in 1998. You spend 40 years restoring family photographs for estates and probate attorneys. You start treating pictures differently than most people do. Most folks see memories. I see timelines, evidence, tiny frozen details nobody notices until they matter. The funny thing is, I never meant to become good at reading people through photographs. It just happened after years of restoring smoke-damaged wedding albums and sorting through boxes after somebody died. Families always tell the truth eventually. Sometimes it comes out in court, sometimes over bourbon at funerals, and sometimes it's hidden behind a picture frame. Now, before you start imagining I lived in some giant, creepy museum full of dusty portraits staring at visitors like a haunted hotel lobby, let me stop you right there. My house felt normal, warm even. The recliner in the living room had duct tape under the armrest because I refused to spend $400 replacing a perfectly good chair. The kitchen clock ran 4 minutes slow because Linda claimed it reduced stress. We drank Maxwell House coffee because she said expensive coffee tasted too proud of itself. That was Linda. Sharp sense of humor. Elementary school teacher for 32 years. Tiny woman, 5'2" on a generous day. But I watched 6-foot tall fathers apologize to her during parent conferences like they'd been called into the principal's office by the FBI. She had a way of looking at people that made them confess things accidentally. Brandon inherited that from her. At least he used to. My son wasn't born greedy. I need you to understand that part. That matters. When Brandon was 8 years old, he cried for 2 straight hours after hitting a squirrel with his bicycle, buried the thing in a shoebox beside the fence, and made a cross out of paint sticks from my garage. Sweet kid. Sensitive. The kind of boy who used to sit beside Linda while she graded spelling tests. But somewhere between becoming successful and becoming impressed with his own success, he changed. It happened slowly. That's how these things always happen. He got into real estate in his early 30s, and suddenly everything became numbers, equity, market timing, appreciation rates, tax leverage. He stopped talking about houses like homes and started talking about them like poker chips. You know that tone people get when they think they figured out how the world really works? Brandon developed that tone around age 36, and once it shows up, it rarely leaves. The first time I noticed it clearly was during Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. Linda had already passed by then. Brandon stood in my kitchen eating mashed potatoes while scrolling Zillow listings on his phone. He looked around the house and casually said, "This neighborhood's getting hot now. You're probably sitting on 400 grand easy, not, this place means a lot, not mom loved this kitchen, just numbers." I remember staring at him while holding a gravy boat thinking, well, that sentence told me more than you intended. Still, he was my son. And love makes people explain away warning signs they'd recognize instantly in strangers. That's the dangerous part. My closest friend during those years was Nancy Delgado from 2 houses down, 67 years old, retired ER nurse. Walked like she was perpetually late for an argument. Nancy had this aggressive kindness about her. She'd show up uninvited carrying aluminum trays of food and insult your curtains while helping wash dishes. One Tuesday afternoon, she brought over meatloaf and found me sitting on the floor organizing old photographs. "You know, normal retirees play golf." "Scott," she said, "I don't trust a sport where pants have to negotiate with your knees." She snorted so hard iced tea came out her nose. That's the thing about grief. If you're lucky, somebody stays nearby who still remembers how to make you laugh without making you feel guilty for laughing. Nancy was that person for me. Around that same time, Brandon started visiting more often. At first, I appreciated it. He'd stop by after work, wearing those expensive fitted jackets real estate guys love, carrying coffees from Indaba or Rocket Bakery, talking fast into Bluetooth earbuds, even while standing in my living room. But eventually, I noticed something. He kept staring at the walls, not emotionally, not nostalgically, strategically, especially at the larger frames. One evening in February, he stood in the hallway looking at a framed black and white wedding photograph of Linda and me from 1978. "You ever think about downsizing?" he asked casually. There it was again. Not, "How are you doing alone?" Not, "You miss mom today." Downsizing. I shrugged. This house still works fine. "Yeah, but the market's crazy right now." "You could cash out, get a condo near downtown, maybe travel." I laughed. At my age, travel just means discovering new pharmacies. He smiled politely, but his eyes stayed on the photograph. That mattered more than I realized at the time, because Brandon wasn't looking at memories anymore. He was evaluating inventory. And once a person starts seeing family that way, they stop noticing the line between helping and taking. A week before I landed in the hospital, Brandon came by unexpectedly around 7:30 at night. Snow melting outside. See a basketball playing quietly on television. He wandered through the living room while I fixed a bowl of canned tomato soup. Then he stopped in front of the staircase wall. 7 framed photographs there. He tilted his head slightly. "You still keeping all these old things up, huh, old things?" That phrase stayed with me longer than it should have, because the way he said it, it sounded less like affection and more like calculation. I should have paid more attention to the way Brandon kept staring at my walls. The heart pain started at exactly 6:42 on a Thursday morning while I was standing on a folding ladder trying to change the battery in the hallway smoke detector. Not dramatic movie pain. No clutching my chest and collapsing into furniture while violins played in the background. Just a sudden pressure right under my ribs, like somebody slid a concrete block inside my chest and forgot to ask permission first. I remember blinking twice and thinking, well, that's probably not ideal. Then my left arm started tingling. Now listen, men my age have a special relationship with denial. We'll drive around for 3 weeks with a transmission, screaming like an injured moose, but refuse to see a doctor because it'll probably settle down. That was me. My first thought wasn't heart attack. It was, I swear if this turns out to be indigestion from Nancy's meatloaf, I'm suing her. I climbed down the ladder slowly and sat in the recliner. The room felt strangely far away. Television still running muted weather forecasts. Gray Spokane rain tapping the front windows. Smell of burnt toast because I'd forgotten breakfast in the toaster. Then I stood up too fast and nearly hit the carpet face first. That got my attention. I called Nancy because she lived 2 houses away, and because retired ER nurses treat panic like a competitive sport. She answered on the second ring. "What now?" she barked. "I think my chest is staging a labor dispute." Silence. Then immediately, "Don't move." She arrived in under 3 minutes wearing purple sweatpants, unlaced sneakers, and a Gonzaga Bulldogs hoodie like she'd sprinted straight out of bed. One look at my face and all her sarcasm disappeared. "Scott," she said quietly, "we're not messing around with this." 5 minutes later, I was in the back of an ambulance heading toward Providence Sacred Heart Medical Center, while a paramedic named Trevor stuck electrodes to my chest and asked if I knew what day it was. "Thursday," I answered. "Good. And if this ride costs more than $600, just leave me at a bus stop." Trevor laughed harder than the joke deserved. Humor's a strange thing. People use it like duct tape during bad moments. Doesn't really fix anything, but it keeps the cracks from spreading for a while. The hospital smelled exactly the way hospitals always smell. Bleach, coffee, anxiety, old air conditioning. They rolled me through double doors under fluorescent lights, bright enough to expose your childhood mistakes. Turns out, I didn't have a full heart attack. Cardiac event was the phrase they used, which sounds less terrifying until you realize medical professionals only invent softer phrases because the original wording scares people too much. I ended up staying overnight for monitoring. Tiny hospital room, beige walls, ESPN playing silently on television. Plastic pitcher of water nobody ever finishes. Machines making noises that somehow convince you death is nearby even when they're functioning perfectly normally. Around noon, Brandon showed up. Expensive charcoal overcoat, brown leather shoes polished enough to signal satellites. Holding a Starbucks cup and wearing that concerned son expression people rehearse in parking lots before entering hospitals. He hugged me carefully. "You scared me, Dad." "I scared me too," I said. That part was true. For the first 15 minutes, things felt normal enough. He asked about the doctors, asked whether I needed anything from the house, talked about Spokane traffic near Division Street like that mattered to anybody connected to heart monitors. Then the conversation shifted, subtly, like a car drifting lanes before you realize the driver's distracted. "So," Brandon said, leaning back in the visitor chair, "have you updated all your paperwork lately?" There it was. Not a giant red flag, more like a small yellow one. I shrugged. "Depends which paperwork. You know, house stuff, financial things, estate documents." I watched him over the rim of my hospital coffee cup. Funny thing about spending decades evaluating family estates, you become very good at hearing the question underneath the question. And underneath Brandon's question was another one entirely. "How vulnerable are you right now?" "I've got things organized," I said carefully. He nodded too quickly. "Good. Good. That's smart." Then came another question. "Do you still keep important documents at the house?" I looked at him for a second longer this time. You know that moment when your instincts whisper something ugly before your brain wants to accept it? That moment feels cold. Physical, almost. I felt it right there beside that hospital bed. Why, I asked. "Oh, nothing," he smiled. "Just thinking practically. If something happened unexpectedly, Claire and I wouldn't even know where to start helping you." Helping. That word would come back later too. He stood and wandered casually around the room while talking, looking out the window, checking his phone every 30 seconds. Real estate guys do that constantly. They behave like every text message might contain $1 million opportunity. Then he said something that tightened my stomach harder than the chest pain had. "You ever set up a trust? Now stay with me here." Most people wouldn't think twice about that question. But I did. Because trusts aren't casual dinner conversation unless somebody's already thinking about inheritance, probate, or control. I kept my voice even. "Your mother and I handled things years ago." He turned back immediately. "What kind of setup?" There it was again. Too fast. Too interested. I smiled slightly. "The boring kind." He laughed, but not naturally. And suddenly, I saw him differently. Not as my son sitting beside a hospital bed, as a man evaluating a situation. That realization hurt worse than anything happening inside my chest. Around 3:15 that afternoon, Nancy stormed into the room carrying a paper bag from Frank's Diner and immediately started criticizing hospital pudding. "Scott's had better meals inside county jails," she announced. "I've never been to jail," I said. Not with that attitude. Even Brandon laughed at that one. But Nancy noticed him asking questions. Nancy notices everything. Retired ER nurses develop radar for emotional weirdness the same way bomb dogs detect explosives. While I ate half a turkey sandwich, Brandon casually asked where my spare house key was. Nancy stopped chewing. Tiny pause. Just 1 second. But I saw it. So somebody can water Dad's plants, Brandon explained quickly. Nancy wiped mustard from her lip and said, Scott owns 2 cactus plants, and one of them's already dead. I almost choked, trying not to laugh. Brandon smiled thinly. You know what I mean. Then he asked whether I still kept the old fireproof document box in the upstairs closet. Now my heartbeat monitor started chirping faster, and not because of medical reasons. Question after question, paperwork, keys, documents, trusts, storage. You spend enough years around estate disputes, patterns become obvious fast. And suddenly I realized something that made my skin crawl. My son wasn't afraid I might die. He was afraid I might die before he understood where everything was. That changes a room, even if nobody says it aloud. Around 5:40, Brandon stood to leave. He hugged me again, but this time I noticed something different. His eyes drifted past me toward the small personal photograph sitting near the hospital bed. A framed picture of Linda smiling on the back porch 15 years ago. He stared at it half a second too long. Then he looked away. You get some rest, Dad, he said, but his voice sounded distracted, busy. Like part of him had already left the hospital and gone somewhere else entirely. Toward my house. Toward my walls. That was the first moment I realized my son was counting paperwork before he counted heartbeats. Brandon entered my house at 8:17 Friday morning using the spare key hidden inside the fake gray landscaping rock beside the porch steps. I know the exact time because Mrs. Whitaker across the street wrote it down. Now, before you assume Evelyn Whitaker was some nosy old neighborhood surveillance drone peeking through curtains all day, let me defend her slightly. The woman was 82 years old, widowed, and treated her front window like a national security observation post. She knew every dog walker, every Amazon truck, and every teenager who rolled through stop signs within 3 blocks. Honestly, Spokane should have hired her instead of traffic cameras. Nancy called her the CIA wrapped in cardigan sweaters. Turns out Evelyn noticed Brandon's black Chevy Tahoe pull up because he parked halfway over the curb in front of my mailbox. That irritated her immediately. People underestimate how much useful information irritated elderly women collect. According to Evelyn, Brandon came alone at first, wearing a navy wool coat and talking on Bluetooth while unlocking my front door. She told Nancy later, he walked in like a man late for a robbery. And honestly, that's not entirely inaccurate. At that exact moment, I was lying in room 214 at Providence Sacred Heart, trying to eat scrambled eggs with the texture of wet insulation foam, while Brandon moved through my house searching for something he couldn't fully define yet. Paperwork, control, leverage, maybe all 3. Stay with me here because this next part matters. Greedy people rarely begin by stealing. First, they convince themselves they're simply locating what should eventually belong to them anyway. That's how they sleep at night. Brandon started upstairs. I know because he left faint, wet boot prints on the hallway hardwood near the linen closet. Snow had melted off his shoes. Tiny details. Most people wouldn't notice. I notice everything. Occupational hazard. For nearly 4 decades, I worked estate recovery cases alongside attorneys, insurance adjusters, and families who suddenly turned vicious after funerals. I learned early that houses record behavior better than people do. Scuff marks, dust gaps, Misaligned objects. Absence tells stories too. Brandon checked the upstairs office first. Desk drawers opened. File cabinet shifted slightly left afterward. Closet door left cracked 2 inches instead of closed fully. He searched fast. That matters too. Careful people restore objects exactly where they found them. Desperate people approximate. Apparently he found nothing useful there because around 8:43 he moved downstairs into the living room. That's where the photographs were. 27 framed photographs spread throughout the house. Different sizes, different decades. Wedding photos, school portraits, fishing trips. Linda holding Brandon as a baby in front of Riverfront Park back in 1984. One black and white picture of my father standing beside a red Chevy pickup in Montana during the winter of 1959. He looked exhausted in that photo. Honest exhaustion. The kind people wore before modern life replaced physical labor with emotional fatigue. Brandon started removing frames from the walls. Fast. Not careful. Mrs. Whitaker later told Nancy she saw him carrying stacks of frames back and forth from the house to the Tahoe like a man clearing inventory from a closing store. You know what bothers me most? Not that he took them. It's how little time he spent actually looking at the pictures first. That's the part that stayed with me. According to Claire later, and believe me, we'll get to Claire. Brandon called her around 9:10 while standing in my dining room surrounded by framed photographs leaning against chairs. Dad hid important stuff somewhere, he told her. Claire apparently asked the obvious question, how do you know? And Brandon said something that would replay in my head for weeks afterward. Because old people always hide paperwork behind sentimental junk. Sentimental junk. Funny how greed strips language down until memories sound disposable. Claire arrived about 20 minutes later. Silver Subaru Outback, Washington plates. She carried coffee from Thomas Hammer and immediately realized something felt wrong. Now, Claire wasn't a villain in this story. Confused, yes. Too willing to trust her husband? Absolutely, but not cruel. That distinction matters. By then, Brandon had already removed most of the larger frames from the hallway and living room walls. He'd laid several face down across my dining table while unscrewing backing panels with one of my own flathead screwdrivers. That detail irritated me more than it should have. Never use another man's tools while stealing from him. There ought to be a commandment about that somewhere. Claire asked him what exactly he was doing. Brandon answered without looking up. Dad's got trust paperwork somewhere. Maybe deeds. Maybe account info. You're going through family photos. I'm organizing. No, she said quietly. You're searching. That stopped him for a second. Not because he felt guilty, because he didn't like hearing the truth phrased accurately. There's a difference. Now here's where Brandon made his first truly stupid mistake. He assumed valuable information would only be hidden behind the largest or oldest frames. That's how impatient people think. Big frame equals big importance. So he focused mostly on the wedding portrait. In the hallway, the framed military picture of my father, the oversized family portrait above the fireplace, Linda's retirement photo from Roosevelt Elementary, but he ignored smaller frames, laundry room pictures, kitchen snapshots, the little walnut-colored frame beside the back stairwell. That one mattered more than all the others combined. He checked maybe 9 photographs total, maybe 10. Not carefully either. He slid cardboard backings loose. felt around with his fingers, opened paper envelopes, found old receipts, duplicate insurance cards, handwritten dates, but not what he wanted. Because Brandon misunderstood something fundamental about me. I spent my entire career protecting documents from predictable people. Predictable people always search obvious places first. Around 10:15, frustration started showing. Mrs. Whitaker said she heard Ray's voices through the partially open front door while walking her dachshund Milton. Claire again. This is insane. Brandon, I'm trying to help before things become a mess. Claire Scott's alive. Long silence after that. Then Brandon said quietly, "You know what I mean, yeah." I do know what he meant. That sentence right there tells you everything about the mental road he'd already traveled down. He wasn't preparing in case I died. He was preparing for ownership afterward. There's a coldness to that kind of thinking. Not movie villain coldness, worse, practical coldness. The kind people justify using spreadsheets and concern. Around 11:02, Brandon made another decision that would eventually destroy him. He stopped searching individually and decided to take all the photographs with him instead. Probably figured he could examine them privately later without interruptions. Maybe he planned to scan them, maybe dismantle them carefully at home. Doesn't matter now. What matters is this. He became careless. Frames stacked carelessly in moving blankets, glass clinking together, hooks scratching wood. One brass hanging nail snapped free and rolled beneath the living room radiator. He didn't notice, but tiny mistakes are loud to people trained to hear them. Before leaving, Brandon walked through the house one final time, checking drawers and closets. Then he paused in the hallway, at the empty spaces where the photographs used to hang. For 1 second, just one, I wonder if he felt something. Regret, shame, maybe memory, but greed moves fast, faster than conscience usually does. By 11:26, the Tahoe backed out of my driveway carrying 27 family photographs and one very dangerous misunderstanding. Because Brandon thought he was taking valuables. What he really took was evidence. I came home Saturday afternoon at 2:18 carrying a paper bag full of prescription bottles and hospital discharge instructions nobody actually reads unless there's a quiz afterward. Nancy drove me back from Providence Sacred Heart in her dented red Honda CR-V while loudly criticizing both modern medicine and Spokane drivers at the same time. Heart monitors, I trust, she muttered while turning onto Perry Street. People merging without signals. Absolutely not. I was tired in that strange, hollow way hospitals leave inside you. Not sleepy, just emptied out. Like somebody had scooped all the energy from your bones using a ladle. The rain had finally stopped. Patches of dirty snow still clung to sidewalks. My front yard looked exactly the same as when I left it. That's the cruel thing about betrayal. The world keeps appearing normal right up until the moment it doesn't. Nancy parked in front of the house and narrowed her eyes immediately. What, your curtains are crooked? Now that might sound insignificant to you, but Linda ironed those curtains every spring for 20 years. Those curtains hung straighter than most marriages. If they looked uneven, something had disturbed them. I felt it then. Not knowledge exactly. Instinct. A heaviness low in my stomach. We walked toward the porch slowly. My chest still hurt when I climbed stairs too fast. Nancy carried my overnight bag while lecturing me about sodium intake like she'd personally negotiated with my arteries. I unlocked the front door and stopped moving. You know those moments where your brain refuses to process what your eyes already understand? That. The walls looked wrong. Not destroyed. Not ransacked. Worse. Empty. Rectangles of lighter paint floated across the living room walls where photographs used to hang. Clean outlines surrounded by years of dust and sunlight exposure. Tiny, exposed squares, like ghosts of missing memories. The hallway looked stripped bare. Above the fireplace, empty. Stairwell empty. Dining room empty. For one full second, I genuinely thought I'd walked into the wrong house. Then I saw the bent, hanging hooks, the scratches, the tiny flakes of drywall beneath the baseboards. And I knew. Nancy whispered, "Oh, hell no." There are different kinds of silence in life. Peaceful silence, lonely silence, church silence. This silence felt violated, like somebody had walked through my memories wearing muddy boots. I stepped farther inside slowly. 27 photographs gone. Not televisions, not silverware, not electronics. Pictures. Family pictures. That specificity matters. Nancy set my bag down hard enough to shake the umbrella stand. "Call the police!" She snapped immediately. But I didn't answer, because something strange was happening inside my head. I wasn't shocked anymore. I was observing. That old part of my brain, the estate investigator part, had quietly switched itself on. You spend 40 years reconstructing disputes from damaged rooms, you stop reacting emotionally first. Your eyes begin collecting details automatically before your heart catches up. I noticed the missing dust outlines, uneven nail removal, scrape marks near the dining table, faint water spots from melting snow. One picture, hook twisted sideways. Fast work. Careless work. I moved into the hallway. Linda's retirement photo gone. Brandon's high school graduation picture gone. The wedding portrait gone. I reached out unconsciously toward the empty space where Linda's favorite photograph used to hang. Taken at Priest Lake in August 1996. She'd been laughing because I dropped hamburger buns into the campfire. That empty rectangle hit harder than the hospital monitors ever did. Nancy touched my arm gently. "Scott," I nodded once. Then I noticed something else. No broken glass. Interesting. Whoever removed the photographs transported them carefully enough not to shatter frames. Not vandalism. Targeted removal. Now stay with me here. That realization narrowed the list of suspects immediately. Random burglars don't steal framed family photos while ignoring televisions and power tools. Someone took those pictures for a reason. And deep down, before I consciously admitted it, I already knew who. Nancy stormed into the kitchen, muttering profanity in both English and Spanish while checking drawers. Did they take anything else? Doesn't look like it. That's insane. No, I said quietly. It's specific. That word changed everything. Specific means intentional. Intentional means personal. I moved slowly through the living room again and spotted something beneath the old cast iron radiator near the front window. tiny brass object. I bent carefully, which at 69, after a cardiac event, feels like negotiating with your skeleton, and picked it up. A brass picture nail, bent slightly at the tip, still carrying flakes of pale green paint from my hallway wall. I rolled it between my fingers, and suddenly I could see Brandis in the room, moving too fast, pulling frames quickly, missing details. Greed accelerates people, makes them sloppy. Nancy returned holding my mail. Nothing else touched. This makes no sense, but it made sense to me. Not fully yet, but enough. I sat slowly in the recliner and stared at the empty walls while late afternoon light pushed through the crooked curtains. Funny thing about missing photographs, your brain still sees them for a while. I could still picture exactly where each frame belonged. Like phantom limbs! Nancy stood beside me with crossed arms, angry in the protective way only old friends get angry. If Brandon did this, she said carefully, I'll run him over with my car. You drive 12 miles an hour. I'll back over him twice. That made me laugh harder than it should have. Actual painful laughing, the kind that grabs your chest. And for 1 second, the tension cracked. That matters too. People think revenge stories are built entirely from anger. They're not. They're built from hurt balanced carefully against memory. I finally pulled my phone out and stared at Brandon's name. Could have called him right then. Could have demanded answers. Could have exploded. But something stopped me. Instinct again. Because if Brandon took the photograph searching for something, I needed to understand what he believed he was looking for before confronting him. That's the investigator in me. Never interrupt somebody while they're revealing themselves. Nancy sat in Linda's old armchair and squinted toward the hallway. You know what bothers me? She asked. What? He didn't even leave one picture behind. I looked toward the empty staircase wall. And that's when another realization hit me. Not every photograph was equally important. Some mattered emotionally, some mattered historically, and some carried information. Tiny, hidden information most people would never notice. Dates, codes, labels, storage references. Linda and I had developed habits over decades working around estate files and family archives. Sometimes we tucked things behind frames temporarily. Notes, receipts, duplicate documents, nothing dramatic, at least not originally. But suddenly, every old habit felt dangerous. I stood again slowly, ignoring Nancy's protest about my blood pressure. Then I walked toward the laundry room. Now listen carefully. Most thieves focus on living rooms and bedrooms. Nobody respects laundry rooms. That's why Linda loved hiding things there. Above the old Whirlpool dryer, there had once been 3 small frame snapshots. Only 2 spaces were empty. I froze. 1 photograph remained. Tiny, walnut-colored frame. Crooked slightly left. Brandon missed one. My pulse kicked harder immediately. Not fear, recognition. Because suddenly I understood the scale of his mistake. And mine. I reached toward that remaining frame very carefully while Nancy watched from the doorway. What is it? She whispered. I didn't answer. Not yet. Because at that exact moment, standing in my laundry room beside 40-year-old appliances and one overlooked photograph, my old professional instincts fully woke up for the first time in years. That little brass nail told me more about my son than any confession ever could. The photograph Brandon missed was small enough. Most people wouldn't have noticed it unless they were specifically looking for symmetry. 5x7 walnut frame, slight water stain in the lower corner. Picture of Linda standing beside our old Maytag washer sometime around 1992, holding up a yellow baby shirt Brandon had somehow managed to stain with what looked like grape jelly and motor oil simultaneously. Linda used to call that photograph domestic evidence. I stood there in the laundry room staring at it while Nancy hovered behind me holding her breath like we were diffusing explosives. "What's so special about that one?" she whispered. "Maybe nothing." But my voice said otherwise. Now here's the thing people misunderstand about investigative work. It's rarely about intelligence. Mostly it's patience, observation, pattern recognition. You stop asking dramatic questions like, "Who did this?" and start asking quieter ones like, "Why this object? Why this room? Why leave this behind? Why move quickly here, but carefully there?" That's where answers live. I lifted the frame gently from the wall, dust outlined behind it, smaller than the others, untouched, meaning Brandon never removed it at all. Interesting, very interesting. I carried it carefully into the kitchen while Nancy followed me with the emotional energy of somebody watching surgery performed on a loved one using kitchen utensils. "You're doing that detective thing again," she said. "What detective thing?" "The thing where your face gets weirdly calm and suddenly I'm afraid you know something." I set the frame on the kitchen table beneath the hanging light. Linda insisted was rustic, despite looking like something stolen from an old fishing dock. Then I turned the frame over. Brown paper backing, old masking tape, my handwriting in tiny black marker near the bottom edge. L7. Nancy frowned. "What's that mean?" I didn't answer immediately because my stomach had suddenly dropped 3 floors. L stood for Linda. The number referenced an archival catalog system Linda and I created nearly 20 years earlier after helping sort through her uncle's estate disaster in Boise. You ever watch family members tear each other apart over paperwork after somebody dies? It changes you. After that mess, Linda started organizing our important records obsessively. Not because we were wealthy, we absolutely were not, but because she believed confusion created cruelty. And she was right. We built a coded storage system tied loosely to family photographs. Harmless at first, practical, easier than renting bank boxes for every duplicate document. Only a handful of photographs ever carried meaningful storage references, and L7 was one of them. My pulse sped up enough that Nancy noticed. "Scott," I carefully peeled the old masking tape upward. The adhesive crackled softly. Underneath sat a folded, yellowing envelope, no bigger than a checkbook. Still there, still hidden. Brandon missed it completely. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Not triumphant, not yet, just deeply aware that the entire situation had shifted. Nancy sat down opposite me. "Please tell me that's not treasure map stuff." "Depends how boring your definition of treasure is." Inside the envelope sat 3 items: a microfilm archive receipt, a handwritten notation sheet, a duplicate trust reference number. Nancy blinked twice. I understood maybe 4 words there. I almost smiled. Now stay with me here because this next part matters more than the missing photographs. Years ago, maybe 2008 or 2009, Linda became worried about what would happen if one of us died suddenly and paperwork disappeared or got contested. We'd both seen too many probate cases where surviving family members conveniently misplaced documents. So Rebecca Whitmore helped us establish a family trust. Rebecca is one of those attorneys who looks permanently unimpressed by human behavior. Sharp gray eyes, perfect posture, drinks tea like she's silently judging civilization. I trusted her immediately. The trust itself wasn't massive. Again, we weren't rich people. The house retirement savings, some insurance money, that was about it. But Linda insisted on adding specific protective language. Families get weird around grief, she told Rebecca once. Rebecca replied, families get weird around houses. Both statements turned out extremely accurate. Part of the trust documentation system involved hidden reference copies linked to photo archive codes, mostly backup verification material. Nothing illegal, just organized. Because Linda trusted paper trails more than promises. And now my son had unknowingly stolen almost every coded reference photograph in the house while missing one of the most important pieces entirely. Greed really does make people careless. I unfolded the notation sheet slowly. Linda's handwriting, small, neat blue ink. Even seeing it after 4 years hit me straight in the chest. Grief sneaks up through ordinary things. Handwriting, grocery lists, coat perfume lingering in closets long after people leave the earth. Nancy looked away politely while I steadied myself. You never fully prepare for the emotional violence of seeing a dead loved one's handwriting unexpectedly. At the top of the page, Linda had written, if you're reading this because something feels wrong, trust your instincts first. That sentence chilled me instantly. Below that sat trust references, archive locations, and one particular clause notation Rebecca specifically recommended years earlier. Protective disinheritance trigger. Now listen carefully. Most trusts contain language preventing manipulation or coercion against elderly trustees. Standard legal precautions. But Linda wanted stronger wording. Specifically, any beneficiary found removing, concealing, or attempting to access protected trust-related property through unauthorized means could immediately lose successor trustee eligibility. At the time, it sounded excessive, paranoid even. Linda shrugged and said something I never forgot. Good people never notice rules like this. Only the wrong people do. Sitting there in my kitchen Saturday evening, I finally understood exactly what she meant. Because Brandon hadn't merely searched the house. He'd removed protected archival property while I was hospitalized. And somewhere out there, probably sitting in his dining room, surrounded by dismantled family photographs, he still believed he was the smart one. Nancy stared at me. Why do you suddenly look terrifying? I don't. You absolutely do. I rubbed my forehead slowly. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Brandon's house and demand the photographs back. But another part, the experience part, understood something important. Never interrupt somebody while they're building the case against themselves. I spent decades watching people talk themselves into disaster because nobody stopped them early enough. And Brandon wasn't finished yet. I carefully repackaged the documents and looked again at Linda's handwriting. At the very bottom, she'd added one final note, Scott: if Brandon ever becomes too interested in the house, pay attention. That one hurt, not because she predicted greed, because she predicted pain. Nancy stood and opened my refrigerator without asking permission. What are you doing? You need food before your blood pressure creates a sequel. She started pulling out leftover chicken salad while I sat there staring at the envelope. You know what the saddest part is? I asked quietly. What he thinks this is about money. Nancy stopped moving, because now she understood too. This wasn't really about inheritance anymore. It was about the moment your child stops seeing you as a parent and starts seeing you as an obstacle between themselves and ownership. That realization changes something permanently inside a person. I slid the documents back into the envelope carefully and stood. My chest still hurt slightly. My legs felt weak, but mentally, for the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt completely awake, because now I knew three things with absolute certainty. Brandon had searched the photographs intentionally. He still hadn't found what he wanted, and he had already crossed a legal line without realizing it. Nancy watched me quietly. Then she said, "Scott, what are you going to do?" I looked toward the empty walls, toward the pale rectangles where our family history used to hang. And for the first time since this began, I stopped thinking like a hurt father. I started thinking like an investigator again. And that's when I realized greed makes people careless. I called Rebecca Whitmore Sunday morning at exactly 9:06. Not because I enjoy involving attorneys in family problems. Nobody enjoys that. Calling a lawyer about your own child feels like accidentally swallowing broken glass. But Rebecca had known Linda almost as long as I had, and if there was one person I trusted to separate emotion from facts, it was her. She answered on the third ring. "Scott." Her voice changed immediately, sharper, concerned. "Nancy told me about the hospital. Are you all right?" "Depends how you define all right. That usually means no." Fair point. Rebecca invited me to her office near Riverside Avenue, but I told her I wasn't ready for stairs paperwork and the smell of legal toner yet. So instead, she came to the house around 11, carrying a leather briefcase and one of those expensive oat milk coffees people in professional jobs pretend taste better than regular coffee. Nancy called it divorce attorney fuel. The three of us sat around my kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows. Empty walls visible down the hallway behind us, like missing teeth. Rebecca noticed them immediately. What happened here? I slid the envelope across the table, and for the next 20 minutes, nobody joked. Now listen carefully, because this is where the story shifts. Until then, I'd still been thinking emotionally, like a father trying to understand why his son crossed a line. Rebecca didn't think emotionally. She thought structurally, legally, precisely. And after reading the trust references and hearing everything Brandon had done, she removed her glasses very slowly and said 6 words that changed the entire situation. He may have triggered the clause. Even Nancy stopped chewing. That's how serious Rebecca sounded. I leaned back carefully. You really think so? Rebecca folded her hands. Scott removing protected archival materials while the acting trustee is hospitalized could absolutely qualify as unauthorized interference, even if he thought he was helping. That made Rebecca raise one eyebrow. Did he ask permission? No. Did he remove family property containing protected documentation references? Yes. Did he conceal that he removed them? Yes. Then he wasn't helping. Lawyers have a way of reducing emotional chaos into clean little sentences that somehow hurt more. Nancy muttered, "Damn!" Rebecca continued reading through Linda's handwritten notes, and then she smiled slightly. Now, if you've never seen a calm attorney smile while examining legal documents, let me explain something to you. It is not a comforting sight. That woman was smarter than all of us, Rebecca murmured. Linda, even dead 4 years, still somehow 3 moves ahead. I looked toward the hallway unconsciously. You know what grief really is? It's continuing to discover new things about someone after they're gone. Rebecca carefully separated the contents of the envelope into neat stacks. The trust references are intact, she said. That matters. Meaning. Brandon searched aggressively without actually understanding what he was searching for. There it was again. Impatience. Greed always wants shortcuts. That's why patient people usually win in the end. Rebecca asked me to describe every question Brandon asked at the hospital. Keys, documents, trusts, storage. She listened without interrupting once. Then she said something that chilled me. He'd already decided the house was becoming available. Not might become. Becoming. That wording matters. Because somewhere in Brandon's mind, my temporary medical scare had already transformed into transition planning, asset management, future ownership. You see, it happens sometimes with aging parents. Adult children slowly stop relating to them as people and start relating to them as upcoming administrative events. That sounds cruel, because it is. Nancy suddenly slammed her coffee mug down. I want to hit him with a folding chair. Rebecca didn't even look up from the documents. Understandable. Legally inadvisable. That got a laugh out of me despite everything. Tiny moment, tiny relief. You need those moments in stories like this, or the sadness swallows everything whole. Around noon, Rebecca asked if there were any other hidden archival references Brandon might have missed. I hesitated, then stood slowly and walked toward the hallway closet. Now here's something I haven't told you yet. Linda didn't only leave backup references, she left observations, private observations, mostly harmless things. At first, birthdays, insurance, reminders, storage notes. But after Brandon entered real estate, her notes changed subtly. She started documenting behavior, nothing dramatic, just patterns, comments, moments, things that bothered her intuition. Inside a faded blue storage box marked Christmas lights, because nobody steals boxes labeled Christmas lights. I found a slim accordion folder. Rebecca opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten notes attached to duplicate photograph references. One note read, Brandon asked twice about house equity during Easter dinner. Another, Claire looked uncomfortable when Brandon discussed selling after we're gone. And another, if Scott dies first, Rebecca should review successor trustee conditions personally before Brandon receives control. I sat down heavily after reading that one. Nancy whispered, Jesus. But the worst note came last. written less than 6 months before Linda died. Brandon is becoming impatient with time itself. I don't know why that sentence hit hardest. Maybe because it was so accurate. Not impatient with me, not impatient financially, impatient with waiting. That's what greed often becomes eventually. Frustration that reality hasn't transferred ownership quickly enough. Rebecca closed the folder quietly. She knew. Not fully, I said. No, Rebecca corrected gently. She suspected. That's different. And she was right. Linda loved Brandon deeply. Nothing in those notes sounded hateful. Concerned, yes. Careful, but never cruel. That's another thing people misunderstand. Protecting yourself from someone you love feels awful while you're doing it. Nobody enjoys creating safeguards against their own child. Around 1:30, my phone buzzed. Brandon. Nancy immediately whispered speakerphone. I ignored that suggestion for obvious legal and emotional reasons. Hey, Dad, Brandon said casually. Too casually. How are you feeling? Tired. Yeah? I bet. Small pause. Then I stopped by the house Friday. There it was. Voluntary disclosure. Interesting. Oh, just checking on things while you were in the hospital. I looked at Rebecca. She slowly began writing notes. I noticed I said evenly. Another pause. Then Brandon laughed lightly. Yeah, sorry about moving some stuff around. I was trying to organize things a little. Organize. Funny how people rename behavior once they need it to sound harmless. You took the photographs. Temporarily. Why? And this next part. Pay attention. Because this was the moment Brandon accidentally revealed the truth underneath everything. He sighed softly and said, Dad, somebody needed to make sure important things didn't get lost if I died. He couldn't even say it directly. Cowardice and greed often travel together. I kept my voice calm. You could have asked. I didn't think it'd matter. There. That sentence. That one sentence told me more than any confession ever could. He didn't think it mattered. The photographs, the memories, the boundaries, my permission, none of it. Because somewhere in Brandon's mind, he'd already emotionally transferred ownership of my life into his future. And once people start thinking that way, they justify almost anything. I ended the call politely after another minute of strained conversation. Rebecca looked at me carefully afterward. Well, she said quietly, that was useful. Nancy crossed her arms. I still vote folding chair, but I barely heard either of them because I'd realized something important during that call. Up until then, Brandon still believed he was ahead. He thought he was searching for hidden documents. He thought he still controlled the situation. And most importantly, he still hadn't realized Linda designed the entire system to expose exactly this kind of behavior. By Thursday afternoon, I stopped wondering whether Brandon would betray me. I started wondering how far he'd go. Tuesday morning, I met Rebecca and Nancy at Frank's Diner on West 2nd Avenue at exactly 8:05. If you've never been there, Frank's sits inside an old converted railroad car with narrow aisles, red vinyl booths, and enough coffee refills to medically concerned cardiologists. Spokane has newer places now. Cleaner places, trendier places, where 27-year-olds with expensive mustaches discuss podcast equipment over lavender oat milk lattes. But Franks understands older people. Nobody rushes you there. That mattered. Rain streaked the windows, while railroad tracks glistened outside under low gray clouds. The waitress Jolene called me Han and brought coffee before I even ordered, because routine becomes a form of affection once you pass 65. Nancy attacked a plate of blueberry pancakes like she held a personal grudge against breakfast foods. Rebecca spread legal papers neatly across the booth table. And me, I sat there staring at the reflection of empty picture frames still burned into my memory. Funny how absence follows you around after betrayal. You look tired, Rebecca said. I got 4 hours of sleep. Nancy snorted. That's because you spent 2 of them pacing your hallway like Batman with acid reflux. Batman had better knees. Batman also didn't eat canned soup voluntarily. This is what friendship sounds like when you're old. Not grand speeches, just mutual harassment with emotional loyalty underneath. Rebecca adjusted her glasses. Let's focus. Right. Focus. Now stay with me here because this breakfast was where the trap truly began. Up until then, Brandon still believed he controlled the situation. He thought he was secretly searching for hidden documents, while I remained confused, weak, distracted by hospital visits and grief. That illusion mattered, because greedy people become reckless when they think they're smarter than everyone else in the room. Rebecca tapped the legal folder lightly. Legally, we already have enough to challenge his eligibility as successor trustee. But I asked, but proving intent cleanly matters. Nancy swallowed pancake. The idiot already admitted taking the pictures. Yes, Rebecca said calmly. But I'd prefer him to reveal why. That's the difference between emotional victory and permanent victory. One feels satisfying. The other survives courtrooms. I stared into my coffee. You want him to talk. I want him comfortable enough to explain himself. Nancy grinned slowly. Oh, this is evil lawyer stuff. Rebecca smiled faintly. Efficient lawyer stuff. Here was the plan. I would call Brandon and casually suggest maybe he was right about downsizing after all. Not aggressively, not emotionally, just enough to make him believe I'd become practical after the hospital scare. If Brandon already had financial pressure, and Rebecca strongly suspected he did, he'd move fast. And fast people make mistakes. You know that expression gamblers get when they think they're one card away from winning the whole table? That's the expression greed gives people. I didn't love the plan, because despite everything, Brandon was still my son. That's the hardest part to explain to people from the outside. Betrayal doesn't magically turn love off. Even while somebody hurts you, part of you keeps remembering birthday parties and scraped knees and school concerts. Pain gets complicated when history is involved. Nancy pointed her fork at me. Don't go soft now. I'm not. You're doing the face. What face? The sad dad face. I have one face. You absolutely do not. Even Rebecca laughed quietly at that. Then she slid another document toward me. Scott, I need you to understand something important. Her tone changed there. Serious. Measured. If Brandon truly believed the house and trust assets were becoming available soon, there's a strong possibility he's already lined up potential buyers or financial expectations around them. I frowned. You think he moved that fast? Rebecca gave me a look. Real estate professionals often monetize future possibilities before those possibilities fully exist. Translated from lawyer language, that meant Brandon may already have mentally spent money connected to my death. That realization landed heavy. Not dramatic, just cold. I looked out the diner window toward passing traffic on 2nd Avenue. There's a particular heartbreak that comes from realizing someone has started organizing their future around your absence. Nancy reached over and squeezed my wrist briefly. Tiny gesture. Human gesture. Sometimes people don't need solutions. They just need somebody physically present while the truth settles into the room. Around 8:52, Rebecca finally said, "Call him." So I did. Speakerphone this time because Nancy would have exploded otherwise. Brandon answered immediately. "Hey, Dad." His voice sounded alert. "Hopeful even. Interesting." "Morning," I said. "You busy?" "Never too busy for you." Now listen carefully. People lie most smoothly when they think they're close to getting what they want. I kept my tone tired, hesitant. I've been thinking about what the house. Small silence. Tiny, but very real. "What about it?" "Well," I sighed softly. "Hospital scared me a little." Nancy rolled her eyes dramatically while chewing bacon. "I'm not sure I want to keep handling stairs and maintenance forever." Brandon responded too quickly. "That makes sense." There it was again. Not sadness, not emotional concern. Relief. I continued carefully. "You mentioned downsizing before." Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the market's still strong around Perry District. Honestly, timing's probably ideal. Timing. Funny word choice. Rebecca scribbled notes calmly. I asked, "You think the house could sell fast?" Brandon laughed lightly. "Dad, I could probably have multiple offers in 48 hours. Too fast again, prepared, like he'd already imagined the conversation. Then came the important part. I said, "Maybe you should come by this week. Help me understand what my options are." And friends, if you could have heard the excitement Brandon tried hiding in that next breath, you would have understood everything instantly. "Of course," he said. "Absolutely. Claire and I can stop by any time. I was thinking maybe meeting with Rebecca too." That pause lasted longer. Why involve lawyers? Just trying to be organized. Now his voice tightened slightly. "Well, sure. If that makes you comfortable." Comfortable. That word almost made me laugh. Brandon wasn't nervous about my health. He was nervous about structure, paper trails, witnesses, the kinds of things greedy people hate once they realize the game may not be private anymore. We arranged a meeting for Friday afternoon at Rebecca's office. After the call ended, Nancy leaned back triumphantly. Oh, he swallowed the hook so hard I heard it through the phone. But Rebecca remained thoughtful. "He's desperate." "How can you tell?" I asked. "Because he moved immediately toward logistics instead of emotions." That's another thing experience teaches you. Healthy people respond to family crises emotionally first. Unhealthy people respond transactionally. Rebecca gathered her papers slowly. "Scott, there's something else. What if Brandon already has a buyer prepared?" She stopped there intentionally. I understood anyway. This wasn't impulsive anymore. This was planning. Potentially weeks of planning. And suddenly the missing photographs looked less like panic and more like acceleration, as if my hospital stay simply created an opportunity Brandon already wanted. That realization hurt deeper than anything else so far. Not because of money, because it meant the betrayal didn't begin at the hospital. It began long before I noticed it. Nancy finally broke the silence. Well, she said, while stabbing the last pancake piece dramatically, if he tries anything stupid, Friday, I'm legally too old for prison to matter. Rebecca sighed. Please stop threatening people during active legal strategy meetings. I'm creating ambiance. Despite everything, I laughed again. And honestly, that laugh saved me a little. Because revenge without humor turns poisonous eventually. Around 10:15, we left Frank's. Rain still falling. Cold wind moving through downtown Spokane. I stood beside my old Ford Ranger while Rebecca locked her car and looked directly at me. All we have to do now, she said quietly, is let Brandon believe he's already won. And standing there under gray Washington skies with empty walls waiting back home, I realized she was right. All we had to do was let Brandon believe he'd already won. Friday arrived cold, wet, and gray enough to make Spokane look like somebody lowered the world's brightness settings. I barely slept the night before. Not because I feared Brandon, because I kept remembering him at 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on my garage floor, helping me restore an old photograph of Linda's grandparents. He'd worn oversized gardening gloves because he thought restoration work required official equipment. That's the cruelest part of family betrayal. Your brain refuses to delete the good versions of people, so they stand beside the bad versions constantly. Nancy picked me up at 12:40 sharp, wearing a dark green raincoat and the expression of a woman emotionally prepared to body check somebody in a legal office. You ready? She asked. No. Excellent. That means you still have a conscience. Rebecca's office sat inside a renovated brick building near Riverside Avenue. Exposed beams, quiet hallways, expensive smelling furniture. Law offices always smell faintly like coffee toner ink and consequences. We arrived early. Rebecca already had documents arranged neatly across the conference table when we entered. Calm as ever. Gray suit, silver reading glasses. The human embodiment of, please reconsider lying in this room. You okay? She asked me quietly. Not particularly. Good. Anger makes people reckless. Hurt makes people careful. That sentence stayed with me. At 1:57, Brandon arrived. Not alone. Claire came with him. And the second they entered the office together, I noticed the distance between them. Subtle, but there. You learn to spot relationship fractures after decades around estate disputes. Couples under stress stop moving naturally around each other. Tiny hesitations appear. Space widens. Claire hugged me first. Real hug. Warm. You look better, she said softly. Mostly held together with medication and sarcasm. That got the smallest smile out of her. Brandon entered 2 seconds later, carrying a leather portfolio folder and wearing a navy-tailored coat that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. He hugged me too, but quickly, distracted already. His eyes scanned the conference table immediately. Documents, folders, pens, structure. He was assessing terrain. Now stay with me here. Predatory behavior rarely looks dramatic in professional settings. Usually it looks organized. Brandon sat beside Claire and placed the portfolio carefully on the table. I already pulled some market comps for the neighborhood, he announced. Too eager. Rebecca noticed too. We're not discussing listings yet, she said evenly. Right. Of course. but disappointment flickered across his face before he hit it. Interesting. Very interesting. The rain tapped softly against office windows, while traffic hissed outside on wet pavement below. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then Brandon leaned toward me with practiced concern. "Dad, I just want you to know this is all about making life easier for you." There it was again. That word, easier. People justify terrible things using comforting vocabulary. I appreciate that I said carefully. And I did appreciate one thing, honestly. He was finally showing me exactly who he'd become. Brandon opened his folder and slid several papers onto the table. Comparative market analyses, projected sales figures, estimated closing timelines. One page highlighted in yellow marker. Projected commission, $38,600. Now listen carefully. He accidentally pushed that page too far forward, just enough for me to read it, and suddenly everything snapped into place. This wasn't theoretical anymore. Brandon already counted the money, emotionally spent it. Maybe literally. Rebecca noticed me noticing. She said nothing. Smart woman. Brandon kept talking. If we move quickly before spring inventory spikes, we could position the property really well. The property. Not your home. Not Mom's house. The property. Claire shifted uncomfortably beside him. You've already talked to buyers, she asked quietly. Tiny pause. Brandon recovered fast. Just informal interest. Rebecca folded her hands. Interesting. That one word carried enough pressure to bend steel. Brandon smiled tightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Rebecca replied calmly, you seem unusually prepared for a conversation Scott only initiated 3 days ago. Silence. You know that moment poker players realize somebody else noticed their tell that? Brandon leaned back slightly. I'm just being proactive, Nancy muttered under her breath, like a raccoon in a jewelry store. I nearly laughed. Claire rubbed her forehead tiredly. Then Rebecca asked the question. Simple. Direct. Brandon, why did you remove the photographs from Scott's house? Everything changed after that. You could actually feel the room tighten. Brandon blinked once, then twice. Now here's something important. People expecting emotional confrontation usually prepare defenses. People not expecting precise confrontation panic differently. They over-explain. Brandon immediately started talking too much. I wasn't stealing anything. Rebecca never said stealing. That mattered. I was protecting important family materials. What materials specifically, Rebecca asked? Well, documents, records, things Dad might have hidden. Why would you think that? And friends, this was the moment. The moment. Greed finally stepped fully into daylight. Brandon sighed impatiently and spread his hands. Because Dad always hides paperwork behind those old frames. The room went completely still. Even traffic noise outside seemed to disappear. I looked at him quietly. Not angry. Honestly, mostly sad. Because there it was. Not concern, not confusion. Calculation. Claire turned toward him slowly. You told me you were organizing. I was. No, she said softly. You were searching. Same word she used before. Searching. Brandon's jaw tightened. You're making this sound worse than it was. Rebecca remained perfectly calm. How many photographs did you remove? I don't know. Approximately 20-something. Did Scott give permission? No, but did you inform him afterward? I was going to. When Brandon hesitated, tiny hesitation, deadly hesitation. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Before or after locating what you were looking for, that hit him hard. I saw it immediately. Because suddenly Brandon realized this conversation wasn't happening emotionally anymore. It was happening evidentially. Different battlefield entirely. Nancy sat silent now, watching. Claire looked pale. And me, I kept staring at my son, wondering when exactly impatience hollowed him out this badly. Brandon tried recovering. Look, I was trying to help avoid probate confusion if something happened to Dad. Something Rebecca repeated. Meaning his death. He swallowed. Well, yes. There it was again. Practical language wrapped around emotional ugliness. Rebecca opened a folder slowly. And you believe trust-related materials might exist behind family photographs? Yes. Why? Because Dad and Mom were obsessive about organization. Not wrong. But listen to the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Brandon understood our habits. He just never understood why we created them. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. Then she asked the question that finally cracked everything open. So, when exactly did you decide Scott's home and estate required your intervention? Brandon frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Rebecca said quietly, you had buyer estimates prepared before Scott formally discussed selling. You entered the home without permission while he was hospitalized. You removed protected archival property, and you concealed the removal afterward. Protected archival property. That phrase landed like a hammer. Claire looked sharply at Brandon. You told me those were just old photos. Brandon snapped. They are old photos. I spoke for the first time in several minutes. No, I said quietly. My voice surprised even me. Calm, cold. They were your mother's memories. That hurt him. I saw it hit. For 1 second, the old Brandon flickered across his face. Shame. Regret. Something human. But greed hates retreat. So instead of apologizing, he doubled down. I was trying to secure the future before things became complicated. And there it was. The truth underneath everything. He already saw my continued existence as the complication. Rebecca slowly reached into her folder. Then she placed a single framed photograph onto the conference table face down. The old wedding picture. Linda and me. And suddenly Brandon stopped breathing normally, because somewhere deep down, he finally realized he may have missed something important. Then Rebecca rested her fingertips gently against the back of the frame and said, Brandon, before we continue, there's something on the other side of this photograph you need to see. Nobody moved. Rain slid slowly down Rebecca's office windows, while that wedding photograph sat face down in the middle of the conference table like a loaded weapon nobody wanted to touch first. Brandon stared at it. Claire stared at Brandon. Nancy looked emotionally prepared to bite someone. And me, I just felt tired. Not weak tired. Soul tired. You spend your whole life raising a child, teaching them kindness, responsibility, patience. Then one day you sit across from them in a law office while they realize they accidentally trapped themselves inside their own greed. That's exhausting. in ways sleep doesn't fix. Rebecca finally turned the frame over carefully. The front photograph showed Linda and me outside St. Mark's Church in Coeur d'Alene on June 17th, 1978. Linda wore a lace dress her mother altered by hand because we couldn't afford a new one. I wore a brown suit that looked slightly too large because I'd lost 15 pounds, working double shifts before the wedding. We looked happy. Not polished. Not glamorous. Real happy. The kind young people are before life teaches them words like mortgage biopsy and probate. Brandon barely glanced at the photo itself. His eyes stayed fixed on the frame backing. Rebecca slid a small screwdriver from her folder and loosened the rear clasps slowly. Click, click, click. Every tiny sound in that room suddenly felt enormous. Now stay with me here because this was the moment the entire story had been building toward from the beginning. Rebecca removed the backing carefully. Then she reached inside. Brandon leaned forward instinctively. There it was. Greed always leans closer. Rebecca pulled out 3 folded documents and 1 sealed envelope. I heard Claire inhale sharply beside him. Brandon's face lost color immediately, because now he understood 2 horrifying things simultaneously. He'd been right that documents existed behind the photographs, and he'd been disastrously wrong about which photographs mattered. Rebecca unfolded the first document calmly. Duplicate trust certification reference, she said. Then the second. Protective succession clause acknowledgement. And finally the third. A handwritten notation page in Linda's unmistakable blue ink. Rebecca read aloud. In the event any beneficiary attempts unauthorized access concealment removal or manipulation of protected archival property while the acting trustee is medically vulnerable, successor trustee status may be immediately revoked pending legal review. Silence. Absolute silence. Brandon blinked once. Then again, no, he said quietly. Rebecca looked up. No, that's not... He swallowed hard. That's not what I was doing. Now listen carefully. This is the part people misunderstand about consequences. The trap rarely closes all at once. Usually people feel it tightening gradually while they desperately search for exits that no longer exist. Rebecca remained calm. You admitted removing 27 framed archival photographs while Scott was hospitalized. I wasn't stealing. The clause does not require theft. Brandon looked at me immediately then. Not Rebecca, me. Because suddenly, he needed the emotional door back open. Dad, he said quickly, you know I wasn't trying to hurt you. And there it was, the little boy again. Not fully, just flickering underneath the businessman panic. That almost made it worse. I looked at him quietly for several seconds before answering. You took memories off my walls like they were inventory tags. That sentence hit harder than yelling ever could have. Claire covered her mouth. Nancy looked down at the table. Even Rebecca paused briefly, because everybody in that room understood the difference between property and memory, except maybe Brandon, or maybe he understood too late. Brandon leaned forward desperately. I thought there might be paperwork hidden there. There was, Rebecca replied evenly. And I was trying to make sure things were organized. Rebecca folded her hands. For whose benefit? That question landed like a gunshot. Brandon opened his mouth. stopped, tried again. Nothing came out. Because finally, he had reached the center of the problem. Not paperwork, not trusts, not houses, motivation. Who exactly was he protecting, me or himself? Claire suddenly spoke for the first time in several minutes. You already had buyers lined up. Her voice sounded small, hurt. Brandon looked toward her immediately. Claire, you already expected the house. No, you expected him to die. Now listen, that sentence wasn't fully fair, but emotionally, it was close enough to the truth that Brandon couldn't answer it, and his silence told Claire everything. Rebecca slid another document across the table. Projected commission estimate, $38,600 highlighted in yellow. You prepared this before Scott officially agreed to discuss selling, she said calmly. Brandon rubbed both hands across his face. I was planning ahead. No, Claire whispered. You were waiting. That one broke something in him. You could actually see it happen. His posture collapsed slightly, confidence draining out in visible stages. Funny thing about arrogance, it depends heavily on believing you're the smartest person in the room. Once that illusion dies, people unravel fast. Rebecca continued gently but firmly. Based on the trust language and your own admissions today, I'll be formally recommending your removal as successor trustee. There it was. Official now. Real. Permanent. Brandon stared at her blankly. You can't do that. I can recommend it. And the evidence strongly supports it. My father wouldn't agree. Everybody looked at me. And honestly, that moment hurt most of all. Because I realized Brandon still believed this was negotiable emotionally. Like enough guilt or family pressure could erase what happened. But betrayal changes shape once it becomes documented behavior. I spoke quietly. I already agreed. That shattered him, not explosively, quietly, which is somehow sadder to witness. His shoulders lowered, eyes unfocused slightly, like a man suddenly discovering the floor beneath him wasn't solid after all. Then came the second consequence. Rebecca tapped the sales paperwork. Since successor authority is suspended pending review, you also cannot represent this property in any transaction. Brandon stared at her, slowly understanding. No sale, no commission, no access. The entire future he'd mentally built over the last week collapsed right there in that conference room. $38,600 vanished in one sentence. Funny thing is, I don't think the money hurt him most. I think being outmaneuvered did. Greedy people can survive losses easier than humiliation. Claire stood suddenly, chair scraping hard across the floor. You lied to me, Claire. You said you were helping your father. I was trying to secure things before probate complications. There is no probate complication, she snapped. He's alive. That one echoed through the room. He's alive. Such a simple sentence, but suddenly it sounded enormous. Because somewhere along the line, Brandon had emotionally shifted me from father into future estate issue. And now reality had snapped back violently. I was still here, still thinking, still watching, still capable of protecting myself. Rebecca finally picked up the sealed envelope from the wedding photograph. This, she said quietly, was addressed specifically to Scott. My chest tightened immediately. Linda's handwriting again. Just seeing it almost broke me. Rebecca handed me the envelope carefully. I didn't open it yet. Couldn't. Not there. Not in front of everyone. Some grief belongs in private rooms. Brandon stared at the envelope with hollow eyes. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, he looked ashamed. Real shame. Not defensive shame. Not embarrassed shame. The deeper kind. The kind that arrives too late to stop consequences. Nancy finally exhaled loudly. Well, she muttered, this got awkward enough to qualify as Thanksgiving. That almost made Claire laugh through tears. Almost. Brandon stood slowly. No dramatic speech. No explosion. Just exhaustion. Dad? He stopped there. Couldn't finish. I looked at him for a long moment. And honestly, I wanted to hate him completely. Would have been easier, cleaner. But all I could see was every version of him at once. Little boy with paint-stained hands. Teenager mowing lawns for extra money. Grown man dismantling family photographs, searching for leverage. People aren't single moments. That's what makes forgiveness so complicated. Finally, Brandon nodded once without meeting my eyes. Then he walked toward the office door. Claire didn't follow immediately. That hurt him too. I could tell. At the doorway, Brandon stopped briefly with one hand against the frame, still not looking back. And quietly, so quietly, I almost missed it, he said. I didn't think it would become this. Neither did I. Then he left. And after everybody else slowly gathered papers and breathed again, the room got so quiet I could hear the air conditioner clicking inside the walls. 3 days later, the photographs came home. Not dramatically, no emotional reunion in the rain, no apology speech on my porch while orchestral music swelled in the background. Just a quiet Thursday afternoon at 4:11 when a silver Subaru Outback pulled into my driveway and Claire stepped out alone carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes. I watched from the living room window while Nancy stood beside me eating pretzels like she was monitoring a wildlife documentary. Well, she muttered, the raccoon returns the jewelry. Be nice. I am being nice. I didn't say rabid raccoon. Claire looked exhausted. Not physically. Marriage, exhausted. That deep emotional fatigue people carry after discovering the person beside them hasn't been entirely honest for a long time. I opened the front door before she could knock. Hi, Scott. Hi, Claire. For one awkward second, we just stood there listening to distant traffic and dripping rain gutters. Then she lifted the boxes slightly. I brought everything back. Everything. Funny word. Because once trust leaves a house, it doesn't fit neatly into cardboard again. I stepped aside quietly and let her enter. The photographs were wrapped carefully now. Bubble wrap. Packing paper. Protective sleeves. Brandon clearly handled them very differently after the meeting at Rebecca's office. Fear improves caution remarkably fast. Nancy followed us into the dining room, carrying coffee mugs like we were hosting an emotionally unstable craft project. Claire started unpacking frames slowly. Some had scratches. One corner of Linda's retirement photograph was chipped. The wedding picture frame needed repair. That one bothered me most. Not because of value, because Brandon handled that photograph while hunting for leverage instead of memory. Objects absorb intention sometimes. I swear they do. Claire finally sat down heavily and rubbed both eyes. He barely slept this week, she said quietly. I didn't answer immediately. Part of me wanted satisfaction. Another part just felt sad. "How is he?" I asked eventually. Claire laughed once without humor. "You really are his father. What's that supposed to mean? You still worry about him after all this?" Now listen carefully. People think forgiveness arrives like lightning, sudden, complete. It doesn't. Most of the time, forgiveness limps into the room exhausted and confused long after the damage already happened. I wasn't ready to forgive Brandon, not yet. But love doesn't disappear just because anger arrives. That's what makes family pain different from every other kind. Claire looked around the empty wall spaces. "He thought he was being smart," she admitted softly. "I know. He kept saying if he could just find the paperwork first, he could control the situation before things got complicated." There was that word again. Complicated. Funny how selfish people describe other human beings once emotions interfere with their plans. Nancy snorted loudly. "Your husband treated a living man like pending paperwork." Claire closed her eyes briefly. "I know. No defense left now. That mattered too. People become more honest after illusions collapse." Before leaving, Claire hesitated near the front door. Then she said quietly, "He really did love his mother, Scott. That one hurt unexpectedly, because it was true. Brandon loved Linda deeply, and somehow still became this version of himself anyway. Human beings are complicated enough to hold both truths simultaneously." After Claire left, Nancy and I stood silently in the hallway staring at stacks of returned photographs leaning against walls. "Well," she said finally, "you want to reassemble your emotional museum only if you promise not to supervise. Impossible. You hang things crooked." I spent 38 years professionally restoring alignment, and yet your porch still leans. Fair point. So we spent the evening re-hanging photographs. And honestly, that part healed something small inside me. Tiny, ordinary moments. Nancy arguing about frame spacing, old nail holes refusing cooperation, dust marks on my jeans, coffee growing cold on side tables, life returning slowly. That's how healing usually works. Not dramatically, quietly. Around 7:40, we reached the wedding photograph, the important one. I held it carefully while Nancy handed me screws from a little plastic container. "You gonna read the letter tonight?" she asked gently. The envelope from Linda sat unopened on the dining room table all afternoon. I nodded slowly. "Probably." Nancy looked toward me carefully. "You want me to leave?" "No." That surprised both of us slightly. But grief gets heavy at night. Sometimes another human being nearby helps keep it from crushing your chest completely. Once the last photograph hung again, we sat in the living room beneath soft lamplight while rain tapped gently against windows. The house felt warmer already, still bruised, but warmer. I finally opened Linda's envelope. Her handwriting stared back at me instantly. "Scott, if you're reading this because of conflict around the house, then I need you to remember something very important before anger convinces you otherwise. People do foolish things when fear mixes with money, especially family. That doesn't excuse betrayal, but it does explain part of it." I stopped there for a second, because that sentence sounded exactly like her. Practical compassion. Linda had this infuriating ability to understand people even while being disappointed in them. I kept reading. Brandon, Always wanted certainty, even as a little boy. Remember how upset he became whenever plans changed unexpectedly. He's not cruel, Scott, but impatience can become cruelty when people stop seeing human beings and start seeing obstacles. Nancy wiped her eyes quietly, pretending allergies existed indoors in February. I continued, "Do not let this house become more important than your heart. Houses are wood. Memory is the real inheritance. And finally, if Brandon ever hurts you this way, make him face truth, but leave the door unlocked for redemption if he ever earns it honestly." I lowered the letter slowly. The room stayed quiet a long time afterward. Then Nancy whispered, "Your wife was annoyingly wise." She really was. At 9:13 that night, my phone rang. Brandon. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hey," he said quietly. No salesman voice now. No polished confidence. Just tired. "Hey." Long silence. "Then I'm sorry. Now listen. Those words matter. But timing matters too. Apologies after consequences arrive carry different weight. Still, I believed he meant it. At least partially, I know I said." Another silence. Then Brandon asked the question that told me shame finally reached him completely. "Did Mom really think I'd become like this?" I looked around the living room, at the restored photographs, at Linda smiling from 30 different decades frozen across my walls. "No," I answered honestly. "She thought you might lose yourself for a while." His breathing cracked slightly on the other end, and suddenly he sounded young again. Not 42, just lost. "I don't know when everything started feeling like pressure," he admitted quietly. There it was, the real thing underneath greed. Fear, pressure, impatience. None of it excused what happened. But understanding matters if healing ever hopes to exist later. We didn't magically reconcile that night. This isn't that kind of story. Trust returns slower than photographs do. But before hanging up, Brandon said something I still think about sometimes. When I took those pictures, he whispered, "I honestly thought I was searching for security." I looked toward the wedding photograph above the fireplace, then toward Linda's letter resting beside my coffee cup. And I answered with the truest thing I learned from all of this. "No, son. You were searching for control, and those aren't the same thing." After the call ended, Nancy stood to leave. At the front door, she hugged me hard and said, "You did good, Scott. I don't know about that. You left room for him to become better." Then she pointed toward the wedding photograph. "And your wife would have kicked your ass if you hadn't." Again, fair point. Later that night, I sat alone in the recliner beneath restored family photographs, while the old kitchen clock ticked 4 minutes slow, like always. The house still leaned slightly left. The hallway still creaked. My chest still hurt sometimes. And nothing was perfectly repaired. But the walls were no longer empty. And somehow, neither was I. Life lesson. Listen carefully. Greed rarely begins with money. It begins the moment people stop seeing each other as human beings and start seeing each other as opportunities, obstacles, or future transactions. That's the real danger. Not inheritance, not houses, not trusts. Distance. Emotional distance grows quietly inside families until one day somebody walks into a home full of memories and sees inventory instead. And if you're lucky, truly lucky, someone in your life leaves behind enough wisdom to pull you back before that distance becomes permanent. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.